Hi, this is Paul Boothroyd, the Maynard Historical Society, and I would like to welcome you all into the Maynard tomb up at the Glenwood Cemetery. This is where the remains of Amory Maynard and his family are all buried. Amory Maynard was born in Marlborough in 1806 over by Fort Meadows. He was the founder of the Maynard Mills, and he was descended from the Maynards from Sudbury, that ascended from this country in England. He did form the Maynard Mills. Prior to that, he worked with Mr. Knight, and they had Jules Mill on Mill Street. And then he was able to secure the land in the center of Assabet Village, and that's where the mill started. They started in 1846. He worked with his sons and so forth up until the 1900s, when it was bought out by the American Woolen Company. It changed its name. Mr. Maynard died in 1890 of just old age, and actually from a fall. He did have a stroke, and that contributed to his death. Mr. Maynard is, I believe, still buried here. There is controversy of whether or not he is here. He lays beside his wife, Mary Priest Maynard, and she predeceased him. She died in 1886. There are some younger members buried of the family. There are a lot of infants in here and so forth. Totally, there are a lot of the family was moved out in 1904. Lorenzo Maynard moved all of his family to a wonderful crypt down at Mount Auburn that he had built. Lorenzo's family got moved, including himself, his wife, a daughter Victoria, a daughter Mary, a daughter Fanny. We'll see that this part of the tomb was set up for William Maynard, his family. And this was Amory's himself, Amory and his wife. Harlem, who was born in 1843, died in 1861, is underneath Amory. The discrepancy came whether or not Amory was here was when they moved Lorenzo and his family out. Some people say that he's probably in Belmont, but nobody else has proved this to us yet, so I believe the mystery of Amory being in the tomb, he's here. And this was Lorenzo's family, and of course most of them were moved out. Frank Sanderson, he was the husband of Mary Peters, is buried in here. Frank Sanderson was very high in politics in the town of Maynard. He also ran a store down on Mason Street, a card store. There's a Mary Susan Peters, there's a Warren Peters, all descendants, all from the Maynard family. There's a Henderson, an L.W. Henderson. He married one of the Peters, Irene Peters. In closing, I would like to say, just give you an idea of how each one of these tombs are set up. There are 3 sections in here, and when they either put the urns, or if they put the casket itself, they slide them in, and of course it's all enclosed. And then when they have the deceased in there, they brick it over and they just close the door. And these are all doors that all made of fine marble that you just open up and close. And in closing, I'd like to say we are going to be going out into the cemetery, and we are going to be talking about a lot of the other important people in Maynard. Maynard in the mill, it was just here. It's the people that we have in the cemetery out here. They're what makes the town, and that's what we're going to talk about next.
The Milford granite archway we see here was completed in 1928, a gift from one of Maynard's leading citizens, Mr. William F. Litchfield. This arch is supported on 2 columns that are 15 feet high and 3 feet through and weighs about 30 tons. Mr. Litchfield was a public-spirited citizen and served on many town boards and was a retired coal merchant. George Smith, the grandfather of Mrs. Litchfield, was one of the first to purchase a lot in the cemetery when it was first established. The gate we see here replaces the earlier archway shown here, and as you enter the cemetery, you see the area in front of you, which was the old spring house that was taken down after the hurricane of 1938, which destroyed 78 spruce trees which surrounded it. Let me give you a little background on cemeteries in general. This part of the country, being settled by the people from the British Isles, naturally has the burial traditions from that country. You realize from the TV shows and the movies that you have seen of old English stories that the cemetery was usually around the church itself, and that there were slate stones with very basic messages on them. And so that's what we find in this country at the beginning of its existence. Of course, out in the frontier, people had to be buried where they could. Some of the rural farms up in New Hampshire and in Vermont, as you drive by an old farm, you'll see a little burial plot that is private, probably with a fence around it to keep the cattle out. In villages, the burials took place around the church, in the cities as well. If you're acquainted in Boston with the burial grounds around Park Street Church and King's Chapel, you'll know what I'm speaking of. Now, about the middle of the 1800s, the cities began to fill up. The land became very, very expensive, and the cemeteries were absolutely crowded. They buried people under the walkways wherever they could. There was also a feeling of something called miasma. Some of the doctors believed that the bodies that were in these graves without any treatment were sending up gaseous fumes that contained disease. And so there was a movement to develop cemeteries which were much more spacious, and the Mount Auburn Cemetery in Cambridge became one of the leading cemeteries in the country. These were known as rural cemeteries. The people that were buried here now could have a memorial. In the past, it was only the rich and the mighty who could afford to memorialize their name, but now the poor were able to have a memorial themselves. The place was usually designed to be very pastoral, a nice place to visit, spacious, quiet, and the names of these cemeteries reflected that. Things like Laurel Hill, Greenwood, Forest Lawn, and here in Maynard, Glenwood. There are not too many designs of the stones in this particular cemetery, because the stones were designed by people based on books that still had the old English designs in them. And so we don't have much imagination used. We have some stelas, some sarcophaguses, some obelisks, some broken columns. The obelisk was very popular at this time because the country itself was building things like the Washington Monument, like the Bunker Hill Monument, and so people put up smaller versions of these obelisks, and we have quite a few of these in this old section of Glenwood. There are other designs pretty much run-of-the-mill, except every now and then in every generation there's always some free spirit who feels that they can do something a little different. If you were to go into the new section, now that technology has shown that different things can be done to stones, we find pictures in color, which really shock you when you first see them. And so we'll take a look around and see exactly what we have here. This section of the cemetery has only the British and then and the Scottish, and then a little further back in the newer section there are some Scandinavians, there's some Russians, some Greeks, but you won't find any Irish, Italians, or Polish here because they're over in St. Bridget's, which we'll talk about some other time.
Archibald and George Robertson both served in the Mass 26th Regular Volunteer Army and died in battle. Orlando Conant, brother-in-law, served in the same company in the band, and you just wonder, did he witness both brother-in-laws being killed in battle? John Dean was murdered by Lorenzo Barnes and was the last person to be hung in Massachusetts in 1896. Captain Reuben Willis, born in 1804 in Sudbury, was married to Mary Walker, whose father was born in the old Garrison House, descendants from early settlers of Sudbury. The Harriman brothers worked in the Assabet mills, built many of the early Maynard homes, and were owners of the Harriman Brothers New Method Laundry, serving eastern Massachusetts. John Harriman was an early postmaster in Assabet Village at the present site of the mill on Main Street. Assabet Lodge is one of the many fraternal lots to provide a place for members to be interred. Edward Miller, who served in the Canadian Army in World War I and died in battle, is buried here. The square at the corner of Main and Nason is named in his memory. William Gurridge came to Maynard in 1863, and his mother Mary wound the first bobbin for Amory Maynard in the Assabet mill. George wrote the first history of Maynard in 1921. The Bent family was from colonial stock, prominent in business, and was prominent in public service. The old homestead was on Summer Street. The Brigham families were early settlers in Maynard, residing at the old Saunders farm, and had a blacksmith shop on Great Road, corner of Old Marlborough Road. The GAR lot was created in Maynard for the deceased veterans of the Great Rebellion. It is in this area, or close to it, that I believe Ruth Trent, first cousin to President Lincoln, is buried. Artemus Whitney, a remarkable man, was born in Stowe, now Maynard. He was instrumental in building over 100 foundations for the early Maynard homes, the mill pond, the canal, the Ben Smith Dam, and many of the first mill buildings. Silas Brooks owned a farm on Summer Street. Luke was the first white man to see the old man of the mountain in New Hampshire while on a surveying trip in 1825. Lucius Maynard, no relation to Amory, lived on Summer Street, former farm of the Gibson family, early settlers in Stowe. In 1938, during WPA work, there was found an early Indian cook site. Joseph Adams, a mill worker, Civil War veteran, returned from the war with one arm.
Henry Fowler was one of the first settlers of the town. He had 5 sons and 1 daughter. As soon as the cemetery was opened, he was appointed to be the undertaker there, the sexton. He held that job for a few years, then gave it to his son Herbert, who passed it on to a brother, Orrin, and so the Fowlers were involved in burials right through to the turn of the century. Then Orrin's son, Geyer, upon return from the war, the First World War, where he served as an ambulance driver in France, took up the funeral business and continued it until his death, at which time he willed his estate finally to the Maynard school system, and in his honor the Fowler Middle School is named.
Mr. Salisbury served as station master when more than 40 trains a day passed through Maynard. Mr. Vitch was overseer of the mill, and the whole town was really saddened when his 17-year-old daughter died at a young age. Mr. Rogers served during the Civil War and was in the Navy. Mulligan Papers. Thomas Mulligan was part of a political scandal who prevented Samuel Tilden from running for president. Levi Cheney was born of the old Stott farm on Summer Lane, now Summerhill Road, was also one of the former homes of Amory Maynard, was the first married in the new town of Maynard to Mary Billington. The Cheney stone is a good example of a steel insert. Franklin Pierce was a relative of President Pierce. Ralph Panton, who died in the service in 1918, had the square of Main and Summer Street named in his honor. Presently, there is no marker on his grave. By next Memorial Day, there should be a long overdue bronze marker. The next section of the cemetery is void of any markers and is where the victims of the Spanish flu 1917-1920 era are buried, all in single graves. Lucius Wilson, also a Civil War veteran, was the father of Judge Wilson, and Judge Wilson's son was Phil Wilson, a prominent attorney and fire chief.
Toward the back of the cemetery, we find the graves of some of the foreign-born. Along the side, there are single graves of Finnish, of Greek, of various nationalities. Some of these people had the inscriptions on their stones in their home language. Also down towards the back on the left-hand side, we find the graves of many of the Russian Orthodox who have their own cross. There is one stone which shows a picture of the deceased, which was a Russian habit, we understand, a Russian custom, but this is the only stone here that has that particular aspect.
The picture is of the pond built during the WPA time, past and present. Dr. Raymond Hoop has served the school children and especially the school athletic team for 17 years. He also served the town of Maynard for 46 consecutive years and was always on call 24 hours a day and never refused medical assistance to the underprivileged or the needy. The Masonic Lodge is a good example of an early stone, and you can see the open Bible on the top. Sylvester Strout, GAR veteran, born of Revolutionary stock, with both grandfathers serving in the War of the Revolution. During the Civil War, he was left on the battlefield for dead and crawled 16 miles to safety. The Palmer family married into the Whitney family mentioned earlier and built on the old homestead. Marble was the first to be buried in the cemetery and is in the Whitney lot. Nelson Hall served in Badaron's sharpshooting unit in the Civil War, cracked unit under Lincoln. The last area is designated for the war veterans with no family lots to be buried in. There is close to 1,000 markers put out every year to honor all war veterans. The red markers are for the fire department. We hope to publish a book about these wonderful people who made it a wonderful town as it is today.